There's a red dirt road I keep coming back to. It runs through the plains of Lango in northern Uganda. Flat country, wide sky, the kind of open horizon that makes the sky feel enormous and the distances between things feel honest, because they are. Between one homestead and the next, you walk or you run. And by the time you're 10 years old, your body has already learned something about endurance that no track coach can fully teach. This story starts there, on that road, sometime in the 1950s. Not in Munich, not on a podium, not with the stopwatch frozen at 47 seconds, because if you begin with the gold medal, you miss the entire thing that makes the gold medal matter. You get the image without the weight behind it. The boy on that road grew up to become the fastest 400-meter hurdler the world had ever seen. But that's not what stopped me when I first came across his name. I grew up in South Africa, where sport is never just sport. Any South African knows what I mean. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when the right moment gets mentioned. A silence that has nothing to do with the sound and everything to do with memory. Just say Edgbaston 1999 and watch a whole room wince at the recollection of a batless Alan Donald stranded halfway down a cricket pitch. You don't need to explain. In this part of the world, a single moment in sport can carry a nation's history inside it, and the athlete carrying it never asked for the weight. So when I first found John Akii-Bua, it wasn't the world record that stopped me. It was the context. Because behind that race in Munich was a country barely a decade old. A country stitched together from kingdoms and clans and colonial borders drawn in London, still, in 1972, trying to work out what it was. Behind it was a regime that had been in power for just over a year and already understood, with uncomfortable clarity, what a gold medal was worth on an international stage. And behind it was a quiet, methodical man from the north, a policeman, a son, a hurdler, who had nothing to do with politics, but could not escape its shadow. He didn't give speeches, he didn't posture, he ran. That contrast is where this story lives, between a regime built on spectacle and a man built on rhythm. I'm wary of easy heroes. I don't trust stories that sand history down into something clean and usable. Real lives, especially African lives in the 1970s, were lived inside pressure systems, coups, Cold War interference, armies that could lift you up one year and endanger you the next. The institutions were new and fragile. The loyalties were old and complicated. You couldn't always tell, from inside a moment, what side of history you were standing on. Sometimes you were just trying to stay upright. Akii-Bua's story moves through all of that. It begins in Lango, in a household where you learned early how power worked, not from textbooks, but from watching who sat where, who spoke first, how authority moved through a room without announcing itself. A chief's household, a large one, 40 children by some accounts. In a family that size, you are not automatically visible. You find your place, or you don't. It runs through the years of independence, that strange, charged decade when the flags went up and the old maps were redrawn and everyone was still deciding what the new arrangements actually meant. It passes through the gates of the Ugandan police force, not as ideology, but as survival. The place where a tall, long-limbed young man from Lera first discovered that his body had an unusual relationship with rhythm and distance. And it arrives, eventually, at a track in West Germany, where everything comes into focus. The lane, the hurdles, the count, the noise of a world watching. But Munich is not the end of this story. It never was. This is a story about how a regime claims victory, about how a nation uses an athlete's body as a symbol without asking permission, and about how a man who mastered the mathematics of the 400-meter hurdles, had to learn, later, a completely different kind of running. Not for a medal, but for his life. This is more than a story. The land that became Uganda was never supposed to make sense as a single country. Look at a map of East Africa and you can almost feel the problem. The borders run in straight lines, the kind drawn by men sitting around a table, carving up a continent they've never visited, with a ruler and a pen. In the 1890s, British administrators drew Uganda into existence around a geographic prize: control of the Upper Nile. Control the Nile, and you controlled Egypt. Control Egypt, and you controlled the Suez Canal, the most direct route to India, the jewel in Britain's imperial crown. Uganda was not a country, it was a strategic calculation. And into that calculation, the British pressed together dozens of distinct peoples, each with their own languages, their own systems of authority, their own long memories of who owed what to whom. In the south were 4 established kingdoms: Buganda, Bunyoro, Ankoli, Toro, with royal courts, centuries of recorded history, and elaborate administrative structures. The British ruled through them. They steered southern elites towards administrative and clerical roles and left the existing power structures largely intact. The north was different. Up in the open plains above the Nile, societies organized themselves around clan networks and lineage systems, the Langi, the Acholi. The British looked at this and saw soldiers. They recruited heavily from the north into the army and the police, while the south accumulated bureaucratic influence and commercial access. This was not an accident, it was a design. And like most colonial designs, it was never meant to be examined too closely. It was just meant to work, for as long as the British needed it to. Then, in 1962, it stopped being a British problem. Independence arrived on the 9th of October that year, and with it came the weight of everything the colonial period had left behind. A new Prime Minister, Milton Obote, a Langi from the north, took power in coalition with the Kabaka of Buganda, the king of the south, who became ceremonial president. 2 power centers, different visions, a partnership built not on shared purpose, but on mutual calculation. It was never going to hold. By 1966, the tension had become impossible to contain. Obote suspended the constitution, arrested 5 ministers, and assumed full executive power. Then he turned to the man he trusted most in the army. That man was Idi Amin. The Kabaka's palace sat 3 miles outside Kampala. On the morning of the 24th of May 1966, Amin's troops attacked it. The Kabaka's supporters were armed and fought for hours. By the afternoon, Amin requested permission to shell the main residence and returned. 2 explosions punched through the palace walls. Then the rains came down, heavy and sudden, and in the confusion, the Kabaka escaped through a side entrance and fled, first to Burundi, then to London, where he died in exile 3 years later. Henry Kiemba, a senior civil servant inside the presidential lodge that day, later wrote that Amin returned bearing his trophies, the Kabaka's presidential flag and his ceremonial cap. He was, Kiemba wrote, jovial. In January 1971, while Obote was in Singapore at the Commonwealth Conference, Amin moved again. He had learned his arrest had been ordered. Rather than wait, he acted. Tanks rolled into position around Kampala. The radio station was taken before dawn, and by the time Obote reached for his phone in a Singapore hotel room, there was nothing left to salvage. Amin was welcomed at first. He released political detainees, promised elections, and listened carefully in cabinet. Kiyemba described him as a model of decorum. But decorum was a costume. Within days, the killing had begun. Langi and Acholi officers, Obote's people, the communities that had formed the backbone of the previous army, were called back under the pretense of routine orders. They were never seen again. At Mbarara and Jinja, scores were killed in organized massacres. At Lira, Akii-Bua's own home region, soldiers who had reported as ordered were bayoneted and thrown into the Nile. These were men from the same region as Akii-Bua. They wore the same uniform. They had joined the army for the same reasons: wages, structure, a pathway into national life. Now think about what this meant for a young man from Lira. John Akii-Bua had been born into the Langi in the late 1940s. When he joined the Ugandan police force in his late teens, he was not making an ideological choice. He was reading the landscape of available options and making the most practical one. But that choice placed him inside a structure with a history he hadn't written. A structure now being taken over by a man who had shelled the king's palace and returned with his flag as a souvenir. The country was now Amin's, and John Akii-Bua was on a training track in Kampala, counting his strides, learning the mathematics of the 400-meter hurdles. The two men were moving inside the same country, the same air, the same political gravity. They had not yet converged, but they were going to. John Akii-Bua had been fast his whole life, fast in the way children from large families learn to be, moving between chores, covering the distances of a northern Ugandan childhood on foot because there was no other way. It wasn't sport yet, it was just life. When he arrived in Kampala in the mid-1960s, a teenager, his father dead 2 years, his mother's instinct behind him, he settled where the city put people like him, a slum. He moved in with cousins and took a job as a cashier in a bar. He was one of thousands of young men from the north who had come to the capital looking for something the plains couldn't offer. What changed it was a football trial. The Ugandan police force had a habit of recruiting through sport, a tradition the British had established and that held long after independence. A recruiter watching that trial noticed the young man from Lira and saw something worth developing. And so Akii-Bua joined the police force. Through the police force, he found the track. In those early years, he competed across everything. At the police track and field championships, he entered 7 events and won 5. His prizes were an alarm clock and some blankets. But the times were going into a notebook somewhere, and the notebooks were being read. Uganda, in those first years after independence, had a project underway. The new government understood something that newly independent nations across the continent understood. Sport was diplomacy without embassies. A gold medal crossed borders. It put a flag on a screen in countries that couldn't find you on a map. To help build that system, they brought in a coach from England. Malcolm Arnold had a trained eye and a specific brief: travel Uganda, identify talent, build a national program. He moved between army compounds and police training grounds, carrying a stopwatch and a notebook, watching how bodies moved. Not for speed, which was visible to anyone, but for efficiency. The way certain athletes conserved energy, the way a long stride properly controlled could eat distance without visible effort. He found what he was looking for among policemen running physical drills: a tall young man, long-limbed, moving differently from the others, not necessarily faster, but more balanced, more economical, as if his body was calculating something his mind hadn't consciously formulated yet. His name was John Akii-Bua. Arnold started him on the sprint hurdles, the 110 meters. 10 barriers in a straight line, explosive and short. Akii-Bua trained hard and responded to the structure, but the times weren't dropping fast enough, and 1968 was an Olympic year. The qualifying mark for the 110-meter hurdles was 14.3 seconds. When the stopwatch delivered its verdict, he was not through. Uganda went to Mexico City without him. But that failure did exactly what the right kind of failure does. It clarified. Arnold stepped back and looked at what he actually had. A man whose stride stayed long and smooth while others were shortening and straining. Someone who could sustain pace over a full lap without losing technical control. That wasn't a sprint hurdler's body, that was a 400-meter hurdler's body. So Arnold pointed him at a different event entirely. The 400-meter hurdles demands a particular kind of intelligence that most athletes never fully develop. It is not a sprint. It is not a middle-distance race. It is both, layered on top of a technical puzzle that must be solved in real time, while the lactic acid builds up and the legs begin to betray you. 10 barriers, 1 full lap. The ideal pattern at elite level is 15 strides between each hurdle, the same 15 repeated 10 times across 400 meters. Break early to 16 strides, even once, and you lose the race. The event rewards runners who can think inside exhaustion, who have practiced the count so many thousands of times that it moves below conscious thought, no longer arithmetic, but something more like breath. But Akii-Bua wasn't easily convinced. The 400 was harder than anything he had attempted, and he still believed his future lay in the sprint hurdles. The 110 was the glamour event, fast, explosive, over in seconds. Arnold disagreed, quietly but firmly. In 1970, Akii-Bua qualified for the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, his first major international competition. Arnold entered him in both events. The 110-meter hurdles went as expected, eliminated in the semi-finals, outpaced by athletes who had spent years sharpening exactly the kind of explosive speed the event demanded. Then came the 400. Minimal preparation, no real expectation. He ran it almost on instinct and finished 4th in the final. 4th at a Commonwealth Games in an event he barely knew he was capable of running. The semi-final exit in the 110 had been a door closing. The 400-meter final had been a door opening, and he nearly walked through it by accident. He stopped arguing with Arnold after Edinburgh. Sessions became structured, repetitive, technical, stride pattern drills, repeated 300-meter efforts designed to simulate the punishment of the final straight. Strength work, speed endurance, precise, patient, almost obsessive in its calibration. Akii-Bua absorbed it without complaint, muttering counts under his breath during practice. In 1971, At a league meeting in Kampala, he broke the African record, becoming the first African to run the 400-meter hurdles in under 50 seconds. Kenyan journalists didn't believe a time like that was possible on a grass track. But Akii-Bua was named to represent Africa in the United States, and in the biggest race of his career to that point, he ran 49 seconds flat, the 6th fastest time in history. That performance booked his place in Munich the following year. Meanwhile, the country he was building it all inside was convulsing around him. The killings in the barracks continued through 1971 in a pattern that was deliberate and systematic. The targets were Lango and Acholi, Akii-Bua's people. But John kept on training, while Amin kept performing. That is the only word for what Idi Amin was doing in those months. He moved constantly, by helicopter and convoy, arriving in areas that had been preparing for him overnight. Platforms were built, people gathered, cattle presented. He was also watching. Amin understood something about international legitimacy that was more instinctive than calculated. He had been a boxer, Uganda's heavyweight champion for 9 years from 1951. He knew what it meant to stand in front of a crowd and project force. He also knew, from years watching colonial officers operate, that certain achievements crossed borders in ways that political arguments never could. A man standing on a podium with a gold medal told a story that required no translation and admitted no counter-argument. Uganda wins. Uganda exists. Uganda is a nation, not just a name on a map. In February 1972, Amin made a state visit to West Germany, the country that would, 7 months later, host the Olympic Games. He came home via Libya, where Gaddafi offered money and new alliances, and the Israeli construction crews that had been building roads and barracks across Uganda were expelled within weeks. The country was pivoting. New friends, new money, new political alignments. And then on August the 4th, 1972, 6 weeks before Munich, Amin addressed troops at a barracks near the Kenyan border and announced that God had come to him in a dream and instructed him to expel 50,000 Asians from Uganda within 90 days. A countdown started on the radio that same day, remorselessly, day by day. The shops that Asian families had run for decades were being handed to army officers and party loyalists. The economy was beginning to digest something that would eventually poison it. Meanwhile, on a training track in Kampala, Akii-Bua was preparing to run the race of his life. His preparation leading up to the Olympics became the stuff of legend in the sport. Each day began with a 15-mile cross-country run, not as warm-up, as foundation. From there, 5 hurdles on the track, 1,500 meters over them, 4 times. Then back-to-back 600-meter efforts. Then a simulation of the final 100 meters of the race, the segment where most hurdlers break, run repeatedly, with the barriers in place, all wearing a weighted vest of 25 pounds. The same vest he wore up a 600-meter hill, 6 repetitions, twice a day. The day closed with another 10 miles of cross-country. There was no mystery to it, no secret, just volume and the willingness to absorb it. One British 400-meter hurdler, watching the program, reportedly called it simply a man killer. Akii-Bua didn't disagree, he just kept running. In early September 1972, the Ugandan team arrived in Munich. Munich was a city trying to be something. West Germany, hosting the Olympics for the first time since 1936 Berlin, had designed everything around openness, transparent architecture, relaxed security, a deliberate aesthetic of welcome. The village was meant to be the place where the politics of the Cold War and the scars of colonialism could be, for a fortnight, set aside. That aspiration would not survive the games. But in those first days, the track was still the track. Akii-Bua moved through the village quietly. His world, as it had always been, was the lane in front of him and the count. Pre-race attention settled on the American, Ralph Mann, one of the fastest hurdlers in the world, and the defending champion David Hemery of Britain, who had set the world record in Mexico City 4 years earlier. Akii-Bua warmed up on his own. The heats were controlled, enough to qualify, nothing wasted. The semi-final was different. Something clicked. He ran 48.32 seconds, an Olympic record. Not the world record yet, but close enough that anyone watching with a trained eye could see what was coming. The night before the final, Akii-Bua lay in his room, unable to sleep. Just before midnight, Arnold came in with a bottle of champagne to steady his nerves. Then, when the bottle was empty, he delivered the news. In the random lane draw, Akii-Bua had been assigned Lane 1. Lane 1 is, by almost every measure, the hardest place to run the 400-meter hurdles. The inside lane follows the tightest curve on the oval. Your body negotiates the bend constantly, leaning into it, compensating for it, and the centrifugal force pulling you outward is stronger here than anywhere else on the track. Several hurdles fall precisely where the curve is most acute, so you're not simply clearing a barrier, you are clearing a barrier while your body is already angled to turn, your weight shifted, your stride mid-adjustment. Over 10 barriers, those differences compound. Lane 1 doesn't suit athletes who run against the field, it suits athletes who run against themselves. Akii-Bua didn't flinch. In the morning, Arnold looked at his athlete and said simply, "One of them is yours." The athletes took their marks, the gun fired. What happened over the next 47 seconds and 82 hundredths has been described in a handful of ways by people who were watching. Most accounts converge on the same observation. It didn't look like a world record. It looked controlled, almost unhurried. His body stayed tall, his stride didn't shorten. He came off the final hurdle with his form intact, no desperate lean, no collapse of the mechanics built over years on dirt tracks in Kampala. He crossed the line with his arms up. 47.82 seconds. Hemery's record, set at altitude in Mexico City, had stood for 4 years. Akii-Bua broke it at sea level, in lane 1, by running 15 strides between every single hurdle for the entire race. Ralph Mann took silver, Hemery took bronze. Uganda's flag rose at an Olympic Games for the first time. The anthem played. A policeman from Lira, a boy who had run to school barefoot on red dirt roads and arrived in Kampala to take a job as a bar cashier, stood at the top of that podium and let the moment be what it was. It was a genuine, extraordinary, unrepeatable athletic achievement. And back in Kampala, 3,000 kilometers away, a man was already reaching for it. Amin understood immediately what the gold medal was worth. A Ugandan alone on a podium, above the Americans, above the British. The national anthem playing in West Germany of all places. Akii-Bua was celebrated in the language of the state, not as a man who had trained for years on inadequate facilities and run a race of stunning technical discipline, but as a product of the nation, as evidence that the nation worked. But 3 days after the race, 3 days after Akii-Bua set the world record, Black September moved. In the early hours of September the 5th, 8 Palestinian gunmen scaled the fence of the Olympic Village and forced their way into the Israeli athletes' quarters. 2 Israelis were killed immediately. 9 others were taken hostage. That night, at the airfield at Fürstenfeldbruck, the rescue operation failed. All 9 remaining hostages were killed. The massacre was broadcast live to hundreds of millions of people around the world. The games were suspended. Then they resumed. The IOC decided stopping would be a capitulation to terror. And then Idi Amin composed a telegram. He sent it to the United Nations Secretary General on September the 13th. In it, he declared his joy at the killing of the Israeli athletes. He praised Hitler. He said Hitler had been right. 8 days after 11 people were murdered at the Olympics, on the same international stage where his own athlete had just won a gold medal, Amin sent a telegram celebrating the killing of Jewish athletes and praising the man responsible for the Holocaust. The condemnations came from governments across the world. In Uganda, Kiyemba and the other civilian ministers were horrified and helpless. There was nothing to be done with an announcement delivered directly by the president to the United Nations without consulting his own cabinet. It simply arrived in the world like everything Amin put into the world, suddenly, loudly, without process. What did this do to the gold medal? Nothing technically. The time on the clock remained 47.82. But context is not nothing. The image of Uganda in September 1972, a gold medal in one hand and a telegram celebrating murder in the other, is a single image, however much we might want to separate its parts. Akii-Bua had no part in that telegram. He had trained and competed and won. But his victory was immediately, automatically annexed. The regime reached out and put its hand on what he had built in years of private repetition and said, "This is ours." Amin's Uganda ran on fear, on arbitrary violence, on soldiers who answered to no law except the mood of the man at the top. Akii-Bua's Uganda, the one he carried inside him, the one he built on the track, ran on opposite principles: precision, repetition, a count that never changed. No political pressure could walk onto that track and alter what the body had been trained to do. That is how power operates around athletes, not usually with a signed document or an explicit demand, just a hand on the shoulder, just a flag on the pole. He had run 15 strides between every hurdle. He had not chosen what came next. John Akii-Bua came home to a country running out of things. The Asian expulsion had hollowed out the economy. Sugar, salt, soap, the ordinary materials of ordinary life grew irregular, then scarce. The army, its officer corps remade entirely around personal loyalty, had become a predator inside a country it was supposed to protect. Akii-Bua, still working as a superintendent in the Ugandan police force, watched as Nubian officials paraded their authority. Every evening, the news reported which officials had been removed from their posts. Everyone understood what that meant. When civilians raised concerns about the killings of Lango and Acholi, Amin had a response. He summoned Akii-Bua and his cousin, Dennis Obua, a national footballer, and paraded them on television as proof that no extermination was taking place. Their recognizability as athletes offered a measure of protection. The rest of their family had no such luck. One evening, 3 of Akii-Bua's brothers, policemen, were detained by the State Research Bureau and driven south towards the Tanzanian border. The family learnt the truth years later. The Bureau had dynamited the room where they slept. The brothers were dead before anyone outside that compound knew they were gone. Then one morning, while out on a training run, a car slowed beside him. He looked at the driver. It was Amin. He was told to get in, driven to a government building, and surrounded by senior army officers. Amin told the room that this man had beaten the whites on the track, and that was worthy of recognition. Akii-Bua was appointed Chief Superintendent of Police on the spot. He accepted. He had no choice. But he told no one outside his household. An elevation in Amin's Uganda was not security. It was proximity, and proximity to Amin cut both ways. Then came Montreal, the 1976 Olympics, another chance to defend the title. Akii-Bua would be 26, peak experience, peak physical capacity. Everything pointed towards Montreal, but he would not run. 29 African nations boycotted the Games over New Zealand's sporting ties with apartheid South Africa. The IOC refused to ban New Zealand, and 29 African nations withdrew. It was a principled stand. The argument that sporting contact with apartheid South Africa legitimized the regime was not wrong. From the perspective of someone who grew up in South Africa, it is hard to dismiss. But it cost Akii-Bua the one thing he had been building towards for 4 years. He was the favorite, and he sat at home while Edwin Moses, 20 years old, running his first major international final, won the gold and set a new world record. The regime had taken something from him this time, not by celebrating him, but by making him invisible, through a political decision he had no voice in. The same structure that had annexed his Munich victory now erased his Montreal opportunity. The loss hollowed him out. He turned to drink. He approached Amin directly for permission to train abroad and was refused, suspected, correctly, of planning not to return. The country he had won a gold medal for had become a prison. In 1978, Amin's army crossed the Kagera River into Tanzania. Tanzania's President Nyerere had been waiting for a reason. He crossed back, not a raid, but an army. Tens of thousands of troops, joined by Ugandan exiles, moved north towards Kampala. The regime that had survived coups and sanctions was not going to survive a conventional military campaign. By April 1979, it was over. Amin got into a vehicle, drove to the airport, and flew out. No final address, no declaration. He ended up in Saudi Arabia, where he lived until 2003. Never tried, never extradited, never held to account. But liberation is not the same as peace. The country that emerged from the Amin years was not capable of immediate stability. 2 exile factions occupied the same capital with their weapons. The institutional fabric had been methodically destroyed. For a Lango soldier, the end of a regime was not simply freedom. It was a different kind of exposure. As the Tanzanian forces pushed north in the spring of 1979, Akii-Bua made his move. He sent his wife, Joyce, pregnant with their 4th child, and their 3 young children east towards the Kenyan border. He would follow separately in his police uniform, just a policeman going about his duties, nothing to see. He left Kampala in his Peugeot at speed. The road east was a gauntlet of checkpoints, each manned by soldiers whose loyalties were shifting by the hour. At Owen Falls Dam, 3 carloads of SRB men appeared on the road. Akii-Bua and his cousin Dennis were pulled over and questioned. Then one of them recognized Dennis and lowered his rifle. Dennis told them they were heading to a nearby town to collect alcohol and would be back shortly. They were waved through. Akii-Bua put his foot down and didn't look back. They pulled back, found where Joyce was sheltered, and waited 3 days while Kampala fell and the old order dissolved. When they moved again, Joyce walked 6 miles through the bush to the Kenyan border, crossing on foot. Akii-Bua drove 3 miles through the bush, stopping to bribe villagers to show him the path through. They made it across. In Kenya, the family was held in a refugee camp in western Kenya for over a month. Joyce, exhausted and malnourished, gave birth prematurely. The baby boy lived for 1 day and died. They had no money to bury him. The man who had set a world record 7 years earlier could not afford a burial for his son. And then someone turned on a television. It was a news broadcast, Uganda, the kind of coverage that was constant in those months. And in the background of a shot, behind the reporters and the officials, was a familiar face, tall, long-limbed, standing quietly in a crowd the way he always stood. One of his sponsors, Puma, recognized him. Word got out through the networks of international athletics, through the modest but real community of people who had followed the sport through the 1970s and still remembered what they had watched in Munich. And they found him. He was resettled in Germany, a few miles from the stadium where he had broken the world record. Puma hired him as a brand ambassador, but it never quite felt like home. And after a few years, he returned to Uganda, returned to the track, and set his sight on another Olympic Games. At the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, he stood on the start line of the same event he had transformed 12 years earlier. He was 34, racing against men a decade younger. He didn't medal, but he ran the count. He died in Kampala in 1997, 47 years old, heart failure, a young death. The regime took what it could use, the exile took what the regime left behind, the years took the rest. But the count, once run, stays run. I started the story with a question. What does it mean to win spectacularly inside a regime like that? Having gone all the way through it, I don't think it has a clean answer, but it has an honest one. The count. 15 strides between every hurdle for the entire race, decided before the gun fired, built over years on tracks that were sometimes little more than packed earth. Maintained through the failure of 1968, through an army being reorganized around him, through a country in free fall. Held all the way to 1984, when a 34-year-old man stood on a start line in Los Angeles and ran it one more time, because that is what he knew how to do. No regime could manufacture that. No political decision made above his head could reach back and undo it. He built the thing. It was his entirely. Amin operated by the opposite logic. He improvised, he performed, he announced. He reached for whatever was valuable in other people's hands and held it up as proof of himself. When Akii-Bua won in Munich, the state claimed the medal. When Africa boycotted Montreal, the state removed his chance to defend it. The athlete had no standing in either direction. What the regime could never reach was what was happening between hurdle 1 and hurdle 10. The internal count, the rhythm rehearsed until it stopped being conscious. That part never belonged to anyone but the man running. In Kenya, in a refugee camp, the world record holder stood in the background of a news broadcast, invisible, waiting. The regime that claimed his victory was gone. The flag that had flown over his podium stood for a country still tearing at itself. And there he was, still himself, still recognizable. A boy from Lira, a dirt track in Kampala, a British coach with a stopwatch, 15 strides held against every pressure the body and the world could generate. The regime saw a symbol, he saw the next hurdle. I think, in the end, that's the whole story. Not the medal, not the world record, not even Munich, as extraordinary as Munich was. Just a man who kept his eyes on what was in front of him, while everything else was falling apart around him, and ran.